She slid the envelope across the table like it was nothing, like 6 inches of paper and cash could erase a woman's entire life. Take it. Haesuk's voice was soft, almost kind, the kind that has teeth underneath. There is more than enough here. You can start over somewhere no one knows your name. Nia stared at the envelope. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear, but from something that had been building for nearly a year, something that had no name until this moment. And if I refuse? The older woman smiled. Then Min-Jae will learn what you've been hiding, and when he does, she let the silence do the work. You'll leave with nothing. What Haesuk didn't know was that the sound of her own voice had already traveled down the hallway, and the man she thought she was protecting was already standing in the doorway. If you've ever had to choose between loving someone and protecting them from a truth that could break them, then this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because nothing about what happens next is simple. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. The roses were Min-Jae's idea. That was the thing nobody would ever know, that the feared head of the Kong organization, a man whose name made mid-level criminals physically nervous, had spent 11 minutes standing outside a flower shop in Gangnam arguing with himself about whether red roses were too obvious. He bought them anyway. He also bought the necklace. Had it custom made, actually, 3 weeks before their anniversary, which was unusual for him. Min-Jae was not a man who planned soft things in advance. He planned operations. He planned contingencies. He planned exit strategies for situations that hadn't happened yet. But somewhere between a meeting in Busan and a call he didn't want to take on the drive back to Seoul, he'd found himself telling his jeweler exactly what he wanted. A thin gold chain with a single dark pearl, because Nia once mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd always thought pearls looked like they were hiding light inside them. He remembered that. He always remembered what Nia said, even when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The drive home that afternoon was quiet. His driver knew better than to fill silence with conversation, so the only sound was the city sliding past the tinted windows, the blur of neon and concrete and 1,000 lives stacked on top of each other. Min-Jae sat with the velvet box in his jacket pocket and the bouquet on the seat beside him and thought about how strange it was, after everything he'd done and survived and ordered done, that the thing he was most nervous about was walking into his own house. Not because anything was wrong, because he wanted to get it right. He'd been gone 11 days. 2 meetings in Tokyo, 1 in Busan that stretched longer than planned. A situation in Incheon that required his physical presence because certain men only believe consequences when they can see the person delivering them. 11 days of calls that were too short and texts that didn't say what he meant. And Nia's voice on the other end of the line sounding fine, always warm, always asking about him before he could ask about her. And he hadn't thought to read anything into that until he was already on the highway back to Seoul at 3 in the afternoon, 3 hours earlier than she expected him. The estate sat behind its gates the way it always did, perfectly maintained, quiet in the way that expensive properties are quiet, like the silence itself costs money. Min-Jae dismissed his driver at the entrance and walked the last stretch himself. He did that sometimes when he wanted a few minutes to decompress, to let the professional version of himself settle before he became something softer behind closed doors. He was maybe 30 feet from the main entrance when he heard his mother's voice. He stopped. Not because the voice was raised. Haesuk never raised her voice. That was something Min-Jae had understood about his mother from a very young age, that the most dangerous version of her was the quiet one, the one that spoke at the volume of a private conversation while somehow filling an entire room. He couldn't make out the words yet, just the tone. And the tone was wrong. He moved without thinking. Years of training, the kind that doesn't come from any school, had made his body capable of complete silence when he needed it. He crossed the remaining distance to the entrance and stepped inside without touching the door to its frame, and he stood in the marble hallway with 11 days of travel on him, and roses in one hand and a velvet box in the other, and he listened. "Take the money and leave my son." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Min-Jae felt the impact of them in his chest before his mind fully processed the sentence. He moved to the doorway. What he saw: his mother, standing straight-backed and composed in the center of the living room, the way she always stood, like someone who had survived enough that posture became a form of armor. And across from her, Nia. Nia, whose eyes were wet in the way that eyes get wet when a person has been holding something back for a very long time. Not crying, just full, like a glass filled too close to the top. Between them on the low table sat a thick envelope, the kind of envelope that doesn't hold letters. Min-Jae's grip on the roses tightened without him realizing it. I'm not abandoning my husband because you're afraid he'll learn the truth. Nia's voice was quieter than he expected. Not weak. He'd never once heard weakness in that voice, but controlled. The way you speak when you've been practicing staying controlled for a very long time. His mother stepped forward, closer. The kind of move that isn't physical aggression but functions exactly like it. If Min-Jae discovers what you've been hiding, your marriage is finished. For 1 second, just one, Min-Jae stood absolutely still. Then he stepped through the doorway. Then tell me what my wife has been hiding. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one outside. This one had weight, had texture. His mother turned slowly, and Min-Jae watched something happen to her face that he had never seen happen before in his 36 years of knowing her. Hyesuk's composure, that impenetrable, unshakable composure that had gotten them both through things that should have destroyed them, cracked. Not completely, but enough that he could see something underneath it, something that looked for just a moment like genuine fear. Nia had gone very still. Min-Jae did not look at her yet. He had learned early that in any room where something dangerous was happening, you watched the threat first. He had categorized his mother as many things over the course of his life. He had never, until this exact moment, categorized her as a threat. Min-Jae, his mother's voice had recovered almost instantly. Almost. You're home early. I can see that. He looked at the envelope on the table. He looked at Nia's face. Then he looked at his mother. How long has she been in this house alone with you today? Hyesuk opened her mouth. Don't answer me with something you've prepared, Min-Jae said, and his voice came out very flat, very quiet. Answer me with the truth. What happened next took nearly 2 hours and felt like longer. Min-Jae did not sit down. He stood near the window while Nia sat on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, and his mother stood across from them both like she was waiting for a verdict she'd already made peace with. Which was the wrong read because peace was not what was in this room. The story came out in pieces. Not from his mother, Hyesuk gave up information the way a person gives up ground. They've spent years defending, inch by inch, only when they absolutely have to. It was Nia who talked. Nia who, once Min-Jae turned to her and said, I need to hear it from you, finally stopped protecting everyone in the room except herself. The first thing she told him was that it hadn't started badly. Hyesuk, in the beginning, had been cold but civil. The kind of cold that can be explained away as cultural distance, generational difference, a mother's natural wariness about her son's wife. Nia had chalked it up to that. She'd come from a family in Georgia where people said exactly what they meant and hugged each other too hard and cried at things other people considered embarrassing, and she understood intellectually that Hyesuk came from a different world, a harder one. She'd tried. She'd genuinely tried. She'd learned enough Korean to greet Hyesuk properly and ask about her health and compliment her cooking, and Hyesuk had received all of it with a small nod that communicated exactly nothing, and Nia had decided that was fine. That was enough. That she would keep trying and eventually something would shift. But Min-Jae kept traveling, and the trips kept getting longer, and when he was gone, she told me I didn't belong here, Nia said it simply, without drama, which made it worse. The first time was about 6 months ago. You were in Tokyo. She came to me after dinner and she said, Nia's jaw worked for a second. She said that a woman from my background could never understand what this family required, that I was kind enough but fundamentally unsuited, that I was… A pause. Decorative. Across the room, Hyesuk said nothing. Min-Jae did not move. I let it go, Nia continued. I thought, okay, she's worried about her son. She doesn't know me yet. I let it go. But it hadn't gone. It had gotten worse in the specific way that unchallenged behavior always gets worse, gradually at first, and then in ways that are harder to ignore. Small exclusions that turned into larger ones. Comments about Nia's family that were delivered as observations rather than insults, which somehow made them cut deeper. gatherings she wasn't told about until Min-Jae mentioned them offhandedly, not realizing she hadn't been invited. Remarks about whether Nia truly understood what she had married into, whether she was capable of the discretion that life in this family required, whether she had carefully considered, what the future actually held for a woman who had never belonged to this world. She never said any of it when you were home, Nia said. She's very precise about that. Min-Jae turned his head and looked at his mother then, just briefly. Hyesuk met his eyes without flinching. He looked away. Why didn't you tell me? Nia let out a breath. Not quite a laugh. Not one either. Because I knew what it would mean. I knew you would feel like you had to choose, and She stopped. You love her, Min-Jae. After everything she did to keep you alive and keep this family standing, you love her. And I wasn't going to be the person who made you feel guilty for that. The room was very quiet. That wasn't your choice to make, he said. His voice was even, but the evenness was costing him something. I know that now. There was more. There was always more. Nia had found the accounts by accident. That was the part that still surprised her, even now. That something this large, this consequential, had come to her attention because she'd been trying to do something small and practical. Min-Jae had asked her, months ago, to handle a charitable donation through the family's legitimate financial offices. A straightforward task. She had access to the appropriate accounts, she spoke with the right people, everything was in order. Except one account didn't match. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a flashing light or a red warning. It was a small notation in a ledger, a reference number that corresponded to an account she'd never seen before. She almost moved past it. Would have moved past it, probably, if the amount hadn't been so large that it stopped her mid-page. She'd asked about it carefully, discreetly. Framed it as an accounting question, nothing more. And the man she asked, a senior accountant who had been with the family for 2 decades, had gone very quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they realize they're being asked about something they were told never to discuss. He hadn't answered her, but his silence had answered her. She'd spent 3 weeks pulling on threads she barely knew how to find. She wasn't an investigator. She wasn't even particularly skilled in finance. But she was methodical in the quiet way that people from modest backgrounds are sometimes methodical. The way you get when you've grown up knowing that mistakes cost real things and that nobody is going to clean up after you. She documented everything she found, kept copies, started a file that she kept on a drive that she kept separate from everything Min-Jae had access to, not because she was hiding it from him, but because she didn't know what she had yet, and she wasn't willing to put something incomplete and potentially dangerous in front of a man like her husband. The name Park Do-hwan appeared 6 weeks into her search. She hadn't recognized it immediately. It appeared in old financial documents, encoded references and correspondence she'd found buried in the estate's physical records, in a name that appeared and then vanished from organizational structures that predated Min-Jae's full ascension to leadership. She cross-referenced it against everything she had access to until she understood who he was. A former lieutenant of Min-Jae's father, someone who had been present at the formation of the organization's most legitimate holdings, and someone who had simply, according to official history, quietly stepped away. The money told a different story. Millions. Not all at once. Park had been careful, spread the transfers across years, buried them in layers of legitimate-looking transactions. But the pattern, once she saw it, was unmistakable. The money had moved. Over a long period of time and through multiple channels, a significant portion of what should have belonged to the Kong organization had been redirected somewhere else. And then Hyesuk had walked into the room where Nia was working. That was the moment Nia identified as the pivot point, the moment when she understood that the situation she was in was more serious than she'd allowed herself to believe. Hyesuk had looked at the papers on the desk for a long time without speaking. Nia had watched the older woman's face and seen something move behind her eyes. Not surprise, not confusion, but something closer to recognition. The look of someone who has spent years hoping a particular door would stay closed and has just realized someone has their hand on the knob. "Put that away," Hyesuk had said. "I need to show this to—" Put it away. Still quiet, still controlled, but different now. "You do not understand what you're looking at." "I think I understand enough." The change in Hyesuk was not dramatic. That was what Nia kept coming back to, that it was not dramatic. The woman hadn't raised her voice or shown anything that looked like anger. She'd just become colder, more precise. The warmth, such as it had been, fully evacuated. "You are going to leave this alone," Hyesuk had said. "And you are going to leave it alone because I am telling you to, and because you are clever enough to understand why." Nia had not left it alone, and so the pressure had increased. The comments became pointed in ways they hadn't been before. The exclusions became deliberate rather than passive. The remarks about her background shifted from condescending to threatening in a way that maintained plausible deniability. Hyesuk never said anything that could be played back as explicit. She was too careful for that. But Nia understood exactly what was being communicated in the space between the words. Stop digging. Stop talking. Stop being a problem. Then, 2 weeks ago, the first mention of money. Not the envelope. That had been today. 2 weeks ago, it had been a different conversation, a more measured version of the same offer. A figure mentioned. An alternative life sketched out in broad strokes. A suggestion that Nia might find herself happier somewhere that understood her better, with resources to start fresh. Nia had refused. The envelope on the table today was what came after refusal. Min-Jae stood very still while Nia finished talking. His jacket was still on. He'd forgotten, somehow, that he was still holding the roses until Nia's voice stopped, and he looked down and saw them in his hand. He set them on the side table. He didn't look at them again. "The envelope," he said. His voice had gone very flat. "Where did the money come from?" Hyesuk answered before Nia could say anything. "It doesn't matter. Mother." He turned to look at her, just looked, said nothing else. Hyesuk closed her mouth. He walked to the table and picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He held it and turned it over in his hands and looked at the sealing label along the edge. A small detail, almost invisible. A banking stamp from a private institution that processed certain accounts for the Kang family's less visible financial holdings. He recognized it immediately. He set the envelope down. Then he reached up and slowly removed his jacket. His mother made a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Because she knew what that meant. She had watched him do it since he was 19 years old. It was what Min-Jae did when he had moved past the part of a situation that involved consideration and had arrived at the part that involved decisions. The jacket was the line between thinking and acting. "You used my father's money," he said. He was not asking. "Min-Jae, to drive my wife out of my house. I was trying to protect you." Her voice for the first time had something in it that wasn't control. Something raw. "Everything I have done, every decision, has been about protecting you." Min-Jae's eyes moved slowly from his mother to his wife. Nia was watching him. Her hands were still in her lap. Her face was carefully composed, but he knew her face the way you know something you've studied deliberately because you wanted to. And what he saw there was a person braced for disappointment. A person who had been braced for disappointment for a long time and had simply learned to wear the posture as a neutral expression. Something shifted in his chest. Not the cold thing. Not the calculating thing that had made him dangerous and effective and feared. Something older and softer and more honest than any of that. "From my wife," he said quietly. "Or from what she discovered." Hyesuk looked at her son. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then, in the silence of the room that was about to change everything, Min-Jae pulled a chair close to where Nia was sitting, lowered himself into it, and reached out and took her hand, the one that had been trembling slightly in her lap where she thought he couldn't see it. He held it until it stopped shaking. Then he looked at his mother and said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had made his decision before he even sat down, "Tell me everything, from the beginning, and don't decide for me what I can or cannot handle." Hyesuk did not sit down. That was the first thing Min-Jae noticed, that his mother remained standing while he and Nia sat, and that this was not an accident. Hyesuk had always understood the geometry of power in a room. She had taught him that, actually, years ago, without meaning to. You watch where people position themselves when they're afraid, and you learn everything. She was afraid now, and she was compensating by staying on her feet. "There are things," she began, "that you were never supposed to know." "That's not a beginning," Min-Jae said. "That's an excuse dressed up as a beginning. Try again." Hyesuk's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Min-Jae, from the beginning, mother, I said what I meant." The clock on the mantel made a sound. A small one. the kind of sound you only notice when a room is completely silent. Hyesuk finally moved, not to sit, but to walk to the window, putting her back partially to them, and Min-Jae recognized that too. It was easier to say certain things when you didn't have to watch someone's face receive them. "Your father," she said, "was not the man you remember." Nia felt Min-Jae's hand tighten around hers, just slightly, just for a second. "I remember him clearly," he said. "You remember the version he chose to show you, which was," she paused, "the best version of him, the one he worked very hard to maintain. And Park Do-hwan?" The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Hyesuk's shoulders moved, not a flinch exactly, more like a person absorbing the impact of something they knew was coming but still weren't fully ready for. "Park was your father's most trusted lieutenant for 11 years, she said. "You know that part." "Tell me the part I don't know." She turned from the window then, faced them. Min-Jae studied her face with the same deliberate attention he gave to situations that could go wrong quickly, and what he saw there was something he hadn't seen since he was very young, since the year after his father died, when Hyesuk had spent 3 months doing something he'd later understand was grieving, though at 17 he hadn't had the vocabulary for it. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Park had been stealing from your father for 6 years before anyone noticed," she said. "Not all at once. Not obviously. He understood how to move money through structures that were already complicated. Your father's holdings were never simple, Min-Jae, even the legitimate ones, and Park understood those structures better than almost anyone else." Min-Jae said nothing. He was listening the way he listened when information was critical, completely, without interrupting, storing everything. "Your father found out 8 months before he died." The clock made it sound again. "He didn't tell me immediately. That was—" Hyesuk's voice shifted slightly. "That was like him. He gathered evidence first. He was thorough. He spent months building a case that would be airtight, that Park couldn't argue with or maneuver around. And when he finally came to me, he had everything: documentation, records, transfer logs going back years." "What did he intend to do with it?" Min-Jae asked. "Remove Park from everything, permanently, and make it known, within the organization, exactly what Park had done and why he was being removed. Your father was— he cared about certain things, about the way the organization understood loyalty and what happened when you violated it. He wanted to make an example that lasted." Nia was watching Hyesuk's face carefully, the way she'd watched it many times in this house over the past year and a half, learning it, reading the spaces between what the woman said and what she meant. There was something in Hyesuk's voice right now that Nia hadn't heard before, a kind of guilt that was fighting with something else. Justification? Maybe. The need to explain herself to herself as much as to anyone in the room. "But he died before he could do it," Min-Jae said. "Yes." "And the evidence?" Hyesuk looked at her son for a long moment. "I had it." The room went very still. "He gave it to me 3 weeks before—" She stopped, reorganized. "He gave me the records and the documentation and told me that if anything happened to him, I was to give everything to you, that it was your inheritance as much as the organization itself, that you had a right to know what Park had done and to handle it as you saw fit." Min-Jae stood up. He didn't do it quickly or dramatically. He just rose from the chair in a single slow movement and walked to the center of the room, and when he turned back toward his mother, his face was something that Nia had not seen before. Not anger. She'd seen him angry, had seen the cold, controlled version of it that was somehow more frightening than volume. This was different. This was the face of someone dismantling something they'd built their understanding of the world around. "You didn't give it to me." It wasn't a question. "No." "Why?" One word, flat as a floor. Hyesuk squared her shoulders. "Because you were 17 years old, and your father had just died, and you were already being pulled in 12 directions by men twice your age, who smelled opportunity in his absence. Because Park Do-hwan came to me within 2 weeks of the funeral and made very clear that he knew about the evidence, and that if I moved against him, he would—" She stopped again. "He would make certain claims about your father's operations, claims that would have brought attention from people neither of us could manage. Authorities, rivals, people who were already watching. So you made a deal with him." "I made a calculation." "Those are different things to you?" Hyesuk's chin came up. "I kept this family alive, Min-Jae. I kept you alive. You were 17 and brilliant and dangerous in all the wrong ways. And Park Do-hwan was a man who had spent 11 years learning how to move inside systems without leaving marks. I was alone and Something in her voice cracked along a very fine line. I made the best decision I could with what I had. You paid him. Yes. For how long? She didn't answer immediately. Mother, how long? 14 years. The number fell into the silence and stayed there. 14 years. Min-Jae did the math without wanting to. He'd been 19 when he formally took leadership of the organization. He had been operating, building, expanding, consolidating for 17 years. And for 14 of those years, money had been bleeding out of the family's holdings through a channel he didn't know existed, feeding a man who had already stolen from his father and had simply never stopped. He walked to the window, stood where his mother had stood, looked out at the estate grounds, the way the late afternoon light was doing something almost gentle to the gardens, which struck him as a strange contrast. How much? He said. Min-Jae? How much did we pay him? Hyesuk named a figure. Min-Jae absorbed it without moving. The number was significant, not ruinous. The Kong organization's legitimate holdings alone had multiplied many times over in the years he'd been running it, but significant. Significant enough to mean something. And this is what Nia found, he said. Not to his mother, to himself mostly, working through it. She found the accounts associated with your father's original documentation, the ones Park had used to conduct the original transfers. I had been using those same accounts, in a limited capacity, to make the payments to Park. It was the only way to maintain separation from the family's current holdings. You were paying a blackmailer with my father's money. I was containing a threat with resources I had access to. Min-Jae turned from the window. And when Nia found it, he said, his voice dropping to something quieter than it had been, which in this context was not a reassuring shift, you decided that the appropriate response was to terrorize my wife. Hyesuk's composure wavered. I did not. A year of it. He was looking at her with an expression that had no heat in it, which was worse than heat. A year of making her feel like she didn't belong in this house, like she wasn't good enough for this family, like the only reason she was here was because she'd manipulated her way in. He paused. Every time my back was turned. I was afraid of what would happen if she told you. So you tried to buy her silence, and when she refused, you tried to buy her absence. He looked at the envelope on the table. With my father's money, which Park had already stolen once. Hyesuk said nothing. Do you understand? Min-Jae said, and now something was coming through the flatness, something that wasn't quite rage but was in the same family as it. How many people in my life I have dealt with for betrayal. Do you understand the standard I apply? Min-Jae, her voice was sharp suddenly, maternal in the specific way that can cut. I am your mother. I know who you are. I sacrificed. I know what you sacrificed. His voice cracked on the last word. Not broke, cracked, the way a surface cracks under pressure, showing what's underneath without fully giving way. Wait, I have known my entire life what you sacrificed. I have carried that. I have... He stopped himself, pressed his jaw together. Everything I built partly because of that weight. Because you kept us alive and I was not going to waste that. He moved back toward the center of the room, toward Nia. But you used that sacrifice to justify this. You turned your suffering into a license to do whatever you decided was necessary, including destroying my wife's life in my own house. Nia had been quiet through all of it, had been quiet in the way she was quiet when she was most intensely present, taking in every word, watching every movement. Her hands were in her lap again. She was not crying. She had stopped, somewhere in the past year, giving Hyesuk the satisfaction of seeing her cry. I have something else, Nia said. Both Min-Jae and Hyesuk looked at her. She reached into the bag beside the couch, her own bag, which she'd placed there this morning, before the confrontation, before any of this, and she produced a sealed document. A physical one, aged at the edges. The kind of thing that had been stored somewhere carefully for a long time. She held it out to Min-Jae. He took it, looked at the exterior, looked at Nia. Where did you find this? In the physical records, in the basement archive, in a box that was filed under your father's personal correspondence. I found it 2 months ago. She paused. I didn't open it. It was sealed with his stamp. I thought, her voice held steady. I thought it should be you who opened it. Min-Jae looked at his mother. Hye-suk's face had gone to something unreadable, which was itself a kind of reading. He broke the seal. He read it standing up. He read it once, quickly, the way he read things when the content was urgent. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again, slowly this time, and nobody in the room spoke while he did it. When he finished the second reading, he held the document at his side and stood absolutely still for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he looked at his mother. He knew, Min-Jae said. He knew you might do exactly this. Hye-suk's mouth opened slightly. This document, Min-Jae held it up, is a legal instrument, properly prepared, witnessed, dated 3 weeks before his death. He paused. He had already arranged for the disputed assets, the ones Park had stolen, the accounts, everything, to be transferred to me upon his death with full documentation of Park's actions, not buried, not concealed, transferred, with instructions that I was to handle it as I saw fit. He set this document on the table, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who understands that certain objects need to be treated with weight. He specifically noted that if there was delay or resistance from any party, including family, the instructions were to be interpreted as standing orders. Hye-suk said nothing, but the color in her face had changed. He anticipated that someone might try to protect him by hiding this, Min-Jae said. He anticipated it, and he put language in this document that addressed it directly. He trusted me to handle this. 17 years ago, he made that decision. His voice had gone very quiet. And you decided he was wrong. You were 17. He didn't say do it when I'm 17. He said do it when I'm dead. Min-Jae picked up the document again. He trusted me. You didn't. You decided your judgment was better than his final instructions. Hye-suk's composure broke. Not completely. She was too controlled for complete breaks, but it fractured in a way that was visible. Her shoulders dropped by a degree. Her hands, which had been clasped in front of her, separated and fell to her sides. She looked suddenly like a woman who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and was beginning to understand that she could not hold it any longer. I was trying to keep you safe, she said. And her voice, for the first time, was just a voice. Not a weapon or a wall, just sound and breath and something that was genuinely tired. Park was dangerous. He still is dangerous. Your father's plan was... It was the right plan, maybe, but your father was also... She stopped. He was not there anymore, and I was. And I made decisions under conditions you cannot imagine. Tell me why you didn't give me the document. She was quiet for a long beat. Tell me, he said. Not the answer about protecting me. The real one. Another long beat. Because, Hye-suk said finally, and her voice was very low, Park told me that if I activated your father's instructions, he would release information that would... It wasn't just about financial crimes, Min-Jae. He had information about operations, about decisions your father made that were... She chose the word carefully. Irreversible. Things that could have been used against you specifically, against your ability to lead, against the organization's stability at a moment when you were still establishing yourself. That's still the protection argument. Yes. So there's no other reason. She looked at him for a long moment. I was afraid, she said. I was afraid of what Park would do, and I was afraid of what your father's choices had created, and I was afraid... She paused. I was afraid that if I handed you that document, you would walk directly into something that would get you killed. The way it almost got your father killed, at the end. The way it did get him killed, maybe, though I have never been able to prove that. The room shifted. Min-Jae went very still in a different way than before. What did you just say? Hye-suk met his eyes. I said I've never been able to prove it. You think Park had something to do with my father's death? I think your father discovered the extent of the theft and began preparing the documentation to expose it, and 4 months later he had a cardiac event at 61 years old with no prior heart condition. Her voice was factual, steady. The kind of steady that comes after you've rehearsed saying something in your head many times over many years. I think the timing was what it was. I think Park understood what was coming and acted accordingly. And I think I had no proof of any of it, and a 17-year-old son in a criminal organization that was waiting to see if we would survive or collapse, and I made a decision to survive. Min-Jae set the document down on the table. He sat down. For the first time in this entire conversation, through all of it, through everything, he sat down. Nia did not reach for his hand this time. She understood instinctively that he needed to be in his body alone for a moment. She sat beside him, and she was present, and she did not make a sound. "You've believed this for 17 years, he said. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "No. Because you thought Park would kill me too if I came for him." Hyesuk did not answer. Her silence was its own kind of answer. Min-Jae sat with it. Sat with all of it, the weight of what had just been said, the specific horror of a grief he thought he understood shifting shape into something new and uglier. The image of his father at 61 years old, thorough and careful and already dead before the last piece of his plan could execute. And his mother, standing over all of it for 14 years, paying the man she suspected of killing her husband in order to keep her son alive. He understood it. He hated that he understood it. He looked at Nia. She was watching him with an expression that was very careful and very gentle and did not try to tell him what to feel about any of it. That was Nia. She had never once, in their entire relationship, tried to tell him what to feel. She'd asked him. She'd made space for it, but she'd never tried to direct it. He thought about what she'd said earlier, that she hadn't told him about his mother's behavior because she knew he loved Hyesuk and didn't want to force a choice. He thought about her sitting in this house, month after month, absorbing every small cruelty his mother delivered, protecting him from a conflict she didn't think he could navigate without losing something irreplaceable. Protecting him. The same way his mother had convinced herself she was protecting him. Except Nia had done it without lies, without manipulation, without trying to buy anyone's silence or erase anyone's inheritance or decide what truths he was capable of surviving. She'd just held it. Held all of it, silently, until it became too heavy not to show. He looked at his mother. "The money you used today," he said, "to try to send her away, that came from the account Park had originally stolen from." "Yes." "So you used money that Park stole from my father, that you then used to pay Park for 14 years, to try to bribe my wife into leaving my house, so she couldn't expose what Park had done." He said it flatly, not with contempt, just with the precision of a man who needed the full shape of a thing laid out before he could deal with it. "When you put it that way, is there another way to put it?" Hyesuk said nothing. "I need you to be honest with me about one more thing," Min-Jae said, "and I need you to actually be honest, not careful, honest." She waited. "Did you try to remove Nia from this marriage because of what she found?" He paused. "Or was that already something you wanted, and the discovery simply gave you a reason to push harder?" The silence that followed was very long, long enough that the clock made it sound twice. "Both," Hyesuk said. Nia absorbed that without moving. Min-Jae absorbed it without moving. "Thank you," he said, which was not what either of them expected. "For finally answering something without deciding first what I could handle." He stood up. He picked up the envelope of money. He picked up the sealed document. He carried both of them to the desk in the corner of the room and placed them there with a care that communicated they were not going anywhere, that they were evidence, and that evidence had weight, and he treated weight seriously. Then he turned and he looked at his mother with the face that, Nia realized, watching him, was the truest version of his face she had ever seen. Not the boardroom face, not the enforcer face, not the version he wore when he needed people to understand who they were dealing with. This was the face underneath all of those. Younger and older at the same time. A man who had just been handed a grief he hadn't known he was still carrying. "You should know," he said to his mother, "that I'm going to find Park Do-hwan." Hyesuk's face went pale. "And everything you've been protecting him from, everything you've been buying him silence about for 14 years, is going to come into the open. All of it, in front of everyone who needs to see it. Min-Jae, if you do that, he will... I know what he'll do." His voice didn't waver. "I've handled men like Park before. I've handled men worse than Park." He let a beat pass. "The difference is, this time I know exactly what I'm walking into. Because you should have told me years ago, but Nia found it for me. Nia, who you spent a year trying to destroy." He walked to Nia then, stood in front of her. "You protected something you thought would break me," he said to her quietly. You sat in this house and absorbed everything she put you through and kept my father's secret because you were afraid of what it would cost me. I didn't know about your father, Nia said. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges. I just knew about the money. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Are you hurt? Hurt? Are you? He stopped because he was not good at this part, had never been good at it, kept bumping into his own limitations around soft words. I need to know if you're okay. She looked up at him. I will be. That distinction, will be, not am, went through him like something sharp. He turned back to his mother. Tonight, he said, I'm calling the senior council. I want everyone who needs to hear this in one room. His voice had shifted into something harder, more settled. The decision had been made somewhere in the last 60 seconds, and the making of it had returned him to himself in a way that was visible. Park Do-hwan is not going to sit on 14 years of leverage over this family any longer, not one more day. Hye-suk looked at her son, and for the first time in the conversation, she looked frightened in a way that was not about being caught. Frightened in the way of a person who can see something irreversible approaching and has run out of ways to stop it. You can't control what he releases, she said. You don't know everything he has. No, Min-Jae agreed. I don't. He reached into his jacket, the one he'd set aside, and retrieved his phone. But here's what I do know. He looked at her over the phone. He's been controlling this family through fear for 14 years, and fear only works on people who believe they have something to lose by fighting back. He held her gaze. I've already lost things I didn't know I was losing. He dialed. The call connected on the second ring. Get me Jun-ho, he said, and Kim Sung-woo. I want everyone in the main room by 8 o'clock. A pause. No, not tomorrow. Tonight. He ended the call. Hye-suk stood in the center of the room looking at her son, and Nia watched the woman's face and saw something she hadn't expected to see there. Not defiance, not calculation, but something that looked almost like relief. Terrible, complicated, deeply unwilling relief. The kind that comes when a person has been holding a secret for so long that even the exposure of it feels, in some broken way, like being set down. Min-Jae put his phone in his pocket. He looked at the document on the desk, his father's handwriting on the seal. His father, who had been thorough and careful and had tried to tie up his own loose ends before the end found him, and who had trusted his son to finish what he'd started. He thought about the 61-year-old heart, the timing, the man who had most to lose from the exposure of what he'd done. He thought about Park Do-hwan, who had spent 14 years believing that the Kang family's silence was permanent, who had built his safety on that assumption, who was, tonight, operating without any awareness that the assumption was about to collapse. Min-Jae set his phone on the desk beside his father's document and stood there for a moment with his hand still resting on it, not moving, not speaking. Nia watched him from the couch and recognized the particular stillness he went into when he was building something in his mind, organizing information, running sequences forward, calculating what each move would cost and what it would return. She'd seen it before. Usually it had nothing to do with her. Tonight, it had everything to do with her. Hye-suk had not moved from the center of the room. She stood with her hands at her sides and her face in a configuration. Nia couldn't fully read. Not quite defeat, not quite resistance. Something suspended between the two that had its own specific gravity. You should eat something, Hye-suk said. To Min-Jae. Just that. A completely ordinary sentence dropped into the wreckage of the last 2 hours, like she'd found it in her pocket and didn't know where else to put it. Min-Jae looked at her. I'm not hungry. You've been traveling for 11 days. Mother. His voice was patient in the way that patience can be a form of warning. Stop. She stopped. He picked up his phone again and made 2 more calls. Short ones, efficient, the kind where he was clearly talking to people who understood that questions were not part of the exchange. Nia caught fragments, a name she didn't recognize, a location in the city. Something about securing access to a specific set of records that were held in a location she also didn't recognize. When he finished the second call, he stood for a moment with the phone in his hand and his eyes somewhere on the middle distance, and then he turned and looked at Nia with an expression that was trying to be steady and mostly succeeding. I need an hour, he said, before everyone arrives. I need to go through the document properly and cross-reference it with what you found. I have everything I compiled, Nia said. On the drive. Get it. She stood. Her legs felt strange, not weak exactly, but like they'd been locked in one position long enough that they needed to remember how to work. She retrieved the drive from her bag. She held it for a second before giving it to him, looking at this small object that contained months of quiet, careful, frightened work, and then she set it in his palm. His fingers closed around it. "Thank you," he said. It was the second time he'd said those words in the last hour, and both times they'd landed differently than she expected. Not perfunctory, not automatic, like he was actually, specifically, accounting for a debt. She sat back down. Hyesuk had moved to the far chair by the window and had placed herself in it with the deliberateness of someone who understood they were no longer running this room and was adjusting their physical position accordingly. She sat very straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was looking at nothing in particular with the focused blankness of someone conducting a very intense internal conversation. Min-Jae sat at the desk and began working. The room settled into a silence that was not comfortable but was, at least, not actively hostile. Nia listened to the sound of papers moving, the occasional click of the drive being accessed, the clock measuring out the last of the afternoon. Outside, the light was going gold and then amber, and the gardens were doing their evening thing where the shadows stretched long and the whole property took on a quality of stillness that had always seemed slightly incongruous to her. All this calm, all this beauty, sitting over everything it sat over. She thought about Georgia, about her mother's kitchen, which smelled like coffee and dish soap, and something always on the stove, about the particular quality of her mother's silences, which were warm rather than weighted. She thought about the first time she'd brought Min-Jae to that kitchen, how he'd sat in the chair that was slightly too small for the table and accepted the coffee her mother pressed on him, and been so carefully, formally polite that her youngest brother had pulled Nia aside and whispered, "Is he okay? He looks like he's testifying." She had laughed for the first time in days that day. She missed laughing like that. At 7:45, Min-Jae closed the document folder, put the drive in his jacket pocket, and stood up. "They'll be here in 15 minutes, he said. He was looking at Nia. "You're going to be in that room." She blinked. "Min-Jae, you found this. You built the case. You're going to be present when it's presented." He paused. "This is not negotiable." "I'm not—" She stopped, tried again. "These are your people, your organization. I don't—" "You're my wife," said simply. Like it was a complete argument, which from him, it apparently was. Nia looked at Hyesuk. Some reflex she didn't fully understand made her do it, some habit of checking the older woman's reaction. Hyesuk was looking at her son with an expression that had something complicated moving through it. Not objection, not approval, something that hadn't found its category yet. "All right," Nia said. The men arrived in the way that men like this always arrived, separately, efficiently, without visible acknowledgement of each other in the driveway, as if they'd each independently decided to visit on a Tuesday evening. Nia stood near the doorway to the main room and watched them come in. 6 men, whose names she knew and whose faces she'd catalogued over the past year and a half of living in this house. She'd learned early that in Min-Jae's world, understanding who was in a room was not a social skill but a practical one. Junho came first. He was Min-Jae's second, had been for years, a decade or more, a compact, quiet man in his mid-40s who processed information with a speed that didn't show on his face. He acknowledged Nia with a nod when he entered. Brief, but genuine. Of all Min-Jae's senior people, Junho had always been the one who treated her most like a person rather than a fixture. Kim Seung-woo came second, broader, louder even in his silence, a man who took up space the way certain men do without seeming to try. He glanced at Nia and then away without acknowledgement, which was normal for him. She didn't take it personally anymore. The others filtered in over the following 8 minutes. By the time the last of them was seated around the long table in the main room, the room had the specific atmosphere that Nia associated with Min-Jae's most serious business, the kind where the air itself seemed to understand that something consequential was about to be decided. Min-Jae stood at the head of the table. He did not sit for this. He'd explained that to her once, early in their marriage, in one of those unguarded moments he sometimes had late at night when he said things she suspected he didn't entirely mean to say. You sit when you're negotiating. You stand when you're not. He was not negotiating tonight. He laid the document on the table. He set Nia's compiled file beside it. He put the photographs, The account records, the transfer logs, the coded correspondence she'd spent months tracking, in a spread across the wood that was deliberate and organized. Each piece had a place. Each piece was part of a sequence. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. His voice was even, carrying to every corner of the room without being raised. "And I need everyone in this room to understand that what I'm telling you has been verified, that it goes back 17 years and that it ends tonight." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The quality of attention in that room was extraordinary. It had a texture to it, a density, the way attention gets when everyone present understands that the wrong reaction could cost them something. Min-Jae began. He laid out Park Do-hwan's theft from his father's organization with the methodical precision of a man who had spent the last hour organizing evidence and had now fully converted that organization into a narrative. He covered the timeline, the mechanism, the amounts, the discovery, his father's preparation of the counter-evidence, the documentation, the legal instrument that should have transferred everything to Min-Jae 17 years ago. And then he stopped. And in that pause, before he could continue, Junho spoke. "Sir." Min-Jae looked at him. "Before you go further." Junho's voice was careful in a way that had a specific quality to it, the carefulness of someone choosing each word because the wrong one has consequences. "There's something you should know, that I should have told you before tonight. A beat. That I should have told you a long time ago." The room did not change physically. The men around the table did not move. But something in the atmosphere shifted, the way pressure shifts in a room when a window opens unexpectedly. Min-Jae looked at his second-in-command. "Say it," he said. Quiet. Very quiet. Park Do-hwan did not disappear from the organization. Junho met his eyes without flinching, which was its own kind of answer about the quality of the man. He went underground, yes. He removed himself from visible operations, but he has maintained, a careful pause, relationships within the current structure, people who have been in contact with him, who have been passing information. The silence that followed was absolute. Min-Jae's face did not change. "How many?" he said. "I don't know the full number. I know of 3 with certainty." Junho looked down at the table surface for exactly 1 second, then back up. "I am not one of them. I want to be clear about that. I became aware of this 6 weeks ago. I have been trying to determine the extent before bringing it to you because I wanted to bring you something complete rather than something partial." 6 weeks, Min-Jae said. "Yes. Park has had informants inside this room for possibly years. I don't know when the relationships began." Min-Jae was very still. Nia watched his face from her position near the wall. She'd chosen a spot slightly behind his right shoulder, visible, but not at the table, present in the way he'd asked her to be present. And she watched him receive this information and process it, and do something that she recognized because she'd seen him do it before in small ways, but never at this scale. He was recalibrating, running back through everything he'd planned in the past hour and reassessing each piece against this new information. She could almost see it happening. "Which 3?" he said. Junho named them. 2 of the 3 were in the room. One of them, a man named Baek Hyun-soo, who had been with the organization for 9 years, and who Nia had always found slightly too smooth in a way she'd dismissed as her own bias, moved. Not dramatically, just a small shift in posture, a reorientation of his weight, the kind of micro-movement that the body makes when it's deciding between options and hasn't finished deciding yet. Min-Jae looked at him. "Don't," Min-Jae said. One word. Baek Hyun-soo went very still. The other man Junho had named, older, closer to the far end of the table, someone Min-Jae had inherited from his father's generation, had gone the opposite direction of Baek. He had gone completely motionless. The stillness of someone who has decided that any action is worse than none. "You've been feeding information to a man who I'm in the process of exposing for theft and blackmail," Min-Jae said. Not to both of them specifically, to the room. "And in doing so, you've been feeding information to a man who—" He stopped and something moved across his face, fast and dark. "Who I now have reason to believe may have been responsible for my father's death." The room reacted to that. Not loudly. These were not men who reacted loudly, but perceptibly. A shift. A stillness that was different from the previous stillness. a reassessment happening simultaneously across 7 or 8 people. Baek Hyun-soo made his decision. He stood up. It happened fast. Not fast enough. Min-Jae was already moving, or rather, Jun-ho was already moving, because Jun-ho had clearly anticipated this particular development and had positioned himself accordingly. What followed was brief and not elegant, and resulted in Baek Hyun-soo being returned to his seat by a method that left no room for discussion. Nia had stopped breathing for approximately 4 seconds. She started again. The older man at the far end of the table had not moved. Min-Jae straightened his jacket. He looked at the older man. "How much does Park know?" he said. "About tonight. About what I've been doing since I got home." The older man, his name was Shin Dae-jung, and he had a daughter in university and a house in Mapo, and had attended Min-Jae's wedding, looked at the table's surface. "He knows you came home early," Shin said. His voice was the voice of someone who has made a decision and is experiencing the physical reality of it. "He knows there was an incident with your wife and your mother. He has a contact in the estate staff." The estate staff? Min-Jae turned very slowly and looked at Nia. She understood what he was looking at. He was looking at everything she'd compiled, every record, every account document, every piece of the case she'd spent months quietly building in the estate where, apparently, someone had been watching. She thought about the drives she'd kept separate, thought about whether separate had been separate enough, thought about the days she'd spent working in rooms she believed were private. "Does he know what she found?" Min-Jae asked. Shin hesitated. "Does he know?" "He knows she found the accounts," Shin said. "He knows she's been building documentation. He doesn't know—" Another pause. He didn't know, as of this morning, the full scope of what she had, but he knows enough. Min-Jae walked to Nia. He did not make a speech about it. He did not announce anything. He simply walked to where she was standing and placed himself between her and the rest of the room, and he did it with the naturalness of someone whose body had decided before his mind had finished processing. And Nia felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she absolutely was not going to let turn into tears in this room. "Is there a contact in the estate staff?" Min-Jae said to Shin, his back now partially to the table, his voice carrying over his shoulder. "Or is there more than one?" "I only know of one." "Name." Shin gave it. Min-Jae nodded once, almost to himself, and then took out his phone and sent a text that Nia could not see and did not ask about. Then he turned back to the room. "Here is what is happening right now," he said. "Park Do-hwan knows that I know, which means the window for moving against him before he can act is measured in hours, not days." He looked at Jun-ho. "I need everything we have on his current location, his properties, his holdings, his contacts outside the organization. Everything." "I've been compiling it," Jun-ho said, "for 6 weeks. It's extensive. Get it to me in the next 30 minutes. Jun-ho stood immediately and left the room, and his efficiency in doing it said more about his loyalty than anything he could have stated outright. Min-Jae looked at Baek Hyun-soo, who was sitting with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who understand their situation has become very small. "You're going to answer every question I have completely and accurately," Min-Jae said, "and then we'll determine what your cooperation is worth." Baek looked at the table. "Yes." Min-Jae looked at Shin Dae-jung. Shin was already looking at him. The older man had the look of someone who had lived long enough to know when they'd made an error that couldn't be taken back, and who had achieved a kind of terrible clarity about it. "I have a daughter," Shin said. It came out like something he hadn't entirely decided to say. "I know you have a daughter," Min-Jae said. His voice was even. "I attended her graduation." Shin's jaw worked. "Which is why," Min-Jae continued, "I'm going to give you the same offer I gave Baek. Complete answers, complete accuracy, and we'll determine what that's worth." He paused. "Don't make me change my mind about the offer." Shin nodded. Once. The nod of a man who has accepted his circumstances. Min-Jae spent the next 40 minutes conducting what could only be described as an interrogation with the civilized veneer of a business meeting. He moved through Baek and Shin with systematic thoroughness, pulling information about the nature and duration of their contact with Park, what they'd passed to him, through what channels, and what they knew about Park's current operations and resources. He took notes on a legal pad in his own handwriting. He did not raise his voice once, The knot raising of it was more effective than any volume would have been. Nia stood against the wall and watched him work, and thought that she was looking at something very few people ever saw, the full, unguarded version of what Min-Jae actually was. Not the version softened for home, not the version armored for show. The functional, genuine article. The man who had built something from nothing after his father died and kept it standing through things that would have destroyed almost anyone else. She thought, this is the person I married, this specific person. And I knew it going in. She had known it going in. She had known, and she had chosen, and she would choose it again, which did not make any of this easier but did make it clearer. At 9:15, Junho returned with a folder. Min-Jae took it and reviewed it standing up, which took 12 minutes. When he finished, he set it on the table and looked at the information on its exterior page for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "He's not in Seoul." Junho shook his head. "Busan. He has a property registered under a subsidiary holding, 3 layers of corporate separation from his name. He's been using it as a base for approximately 8 months. 8 months. Min-Jae considered this, since around the time Nia started finding the accounts. That would fit the timeline. Min-Jae was quiet for a moment. "He ran," Nia said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but she'd been running the timeline in her head, the way she ran numbers sequentially, looking for the logic and the progression, and it had come out. "He knew your mother had been sitting on the evidence for years," she said, looking at Min-Jae. "He knew the payments were ongoing. That was a stable situation for him. But when I started looking at the accounts, she worked through it. Someone told him, someone in the estate, and he understood that if I found enough to bring it to you, the stable situation was over. So he moved, got out of Seoul, put distance between himself and the organization while he figured out his next step." Min-Jae looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. It was the expression he had when she'd worked out something that he'd either already worked out or was in the process of working out, and he was recalibrating her in some internal ranking he kept. "Yes," he said, simply, like she'd passed something. "Which means he's been planning for months," she continued. "Whatever he's going to do, whatever leverage he's going to try to use, he hasn't been improvising. He's been preparing. Also, yes. So the information your mother has been protecting him with, the claims about your father's operations, the things she was afraid he'd release, are probably already prepared for release," Min-Jae finished. "Ready to go if he determines it's necessary. Insurance against exactly this situation." The room absorbed that. Junho said carefully, "If he releases that information to the wrong parties—" "I know what it means," Min-Jae said. "The financial authorities have been looking for grounds to—" "I know, Junho." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. This one was about consequences, about the specific shape of what they were walking toward. Not just the exposure of Park's crimes, but the potential for Park, in being exposed, to take the Kang organization down with him, or at least to damage it in ways that would take years to repair and would leave it vulnerable in the interim to every rival and every authority that had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Min-Jae's father had prepared the evidence against Park knowing this risk existed. He'd decided the risk was worth taking. He died, possibly because of that decision, before he could execute it. And now his son was standing in the same place 17 years later, holding the same evidence, facing the same calculation. Nia watched Min-Jae's face and saw the moment the full weight of it landed on him. Not knocked him down, Min-Jae didn't get knocked down, but settled onto him with a density that showed in the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness. "I need the room," Min-Jae said. The men stood, filed out. Even Baek and Shin, escorted by 2 others who had received silent instructions that Nia hadn't caught. The room emptied in under 2 minutes. Junho was the last to leave. He paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said. "Your father wanted to fight him. He believed the exposure was worth the cost." A beat. "I was 26 years old when he died. I was junior enough that nobody told me anything, but I was in the building enough that I understood more than people thought I did." Another pause. "I have believed for 17 years that Park Do-hwan had something to do with what happened to him, and I have been waiting for 17 years for someone to finally do something about it." He left. The door closed. Min-Jae and Nia were alone in the room with the document and the files and the fold like a case that needed sentencing. Min-Jae sat down. For the second time tonight, he sat down heavily in the chair at the head of the table, and he put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he stayed there for a moment that Nia counted internally because the number seemed important for reasons she couldn't articulate. 7 seconds. Then he lifted his head. He's going to release it, he said, whatever he has. When he realizes we're moving against him, he's going to release everything he's been holding over this family for 14 years. And some of what he has, is going to cause damage that I can't fully predict or control. I know, Nia said. The organization, I know, Min-Jae. You might... He stopped, started again. There are going to be investigations. If the financial authorities get what Park releases, there are going to be investigations into the legitimate holdings, which means my name is attached to some of those holdings, she said, as your wife. She looked at him. I know. He looked at her across the table. You knew this was a possibility when you kept digging, he said. It was not an accusation. It was something closer to awe, which was not an emotion she associated with his face. I knew what I was married to, she said. I made my choice when I made my choice. I didn't dig because I didn't understand the risk. I dug because... She searched for the right words and found the plain ones, which were always the right ones. Because someone stole from your family and got away with it for decades. And because it was wrong. And because I thought you deserved to know. Something happened to Min-Jae's face. It was not dramatic. It was actually very quiet. A shift around the eyes. A release of something that had been held in the jaw. The kind of change that is almost invisible unless you have spent 2 years learning someone's face the way you learn a landscape you love. He stood up. He walked around the table to where she was standing. He was taller than her by a significant amount. And when he stood this close, she was aware of it in a way that was not uncomfortable but was simply a fact of him, of the specific physical reality of this man who was feared by people who had made violence their profession. You should have told me about my mother, he said, quietly. Not with anger, with something more rueful than that. Yes, she said. I should have. Why didn't you? I already told you why. Tell me again, differently. She thought about how to say it differently. Because I was afraid that if I showed you what she was doing, you would feel like you had to choose. And I know you. I knew you'd choose me. And I didn't want you to spend the rest of your life carrying guilt about that. He was quiet for a moment. You were protecting me from my own decision. Yes. Even though it wasn't your decision to make. Yes. He reached up and put his hand against the side of her face. Not a gesture of comfort exactly, more like the gesture of someone who needs to physically confirm that something real is in front of them. His hand was warm. She had always noticed that about him. His hands were always warmer than she expected. Don't do that again, he said. Okay. I mean it. I know you mean it. He lowered his hand. He turned back to the table and looked at everything spread across it. The document, the files, the folder from Jun-ho, the years of evidence that had been waiting for this room. I'm going to bring Park here, he said. Not to her specifically. To the decision itself. Not to Busan. Here. I want him in this room. In front of the organization. In front of everyone who needs to see exactly what he is. That will take time, Nia said. 12 hours, maybe less. He'll come if I make him believe there's still a negotiation possible. His voice had gone to the flat, certain register that she'd come to recognize as him in full operational mode. No heat, no hesitation, just architecture. He's been blackmailing this family for 14 years because he understood that we valued the secret more than we valued the exposure. He doesn't know yet that the calculation has changed. He picked up the document, his father's document, and looked at the old seal, the careful handwriting, the last instructions of a man who had tried to tie up his affairs before time ran out. But when he walks into this room and understands what's waiting for him, he's going to make a choice. He's going to try to detonate everything he's been holding, right there in front of everyone. And what do you do when he does? Nia asked. Min-Jae set the document down. He turned and looked at his wife with the expression she'd been watching develop across his face for the past 4 hours. Not the version she knew from their ordinary life, not the version the world knew from his professional one, but the version underneath both of those. The one that was, she understood now, the truest of the three. I let it happen, he said. She blinked. All of it, he said. Everything he releases, every record, every claim, every piece of leverage he's been sitting on for 14 years. I let it come out, in the open, in front of the organization. His jaw set. Because the only way to destroy something that lives in the dark is to stop protecting it from the light. Nia looked at him. That's going to cost you, she said. Yes. The organization, the legitimate holdings, the investigations, yes. You've spent 17 years building. I know what I've spent 17 years building. His voice didn't waver. And I know that every piece of it that's clean will survive the light. And whatever doesn't survive it, a pause, something moving behind his eyes. My father already told me what he thought that was worth. He was willing to take the exposure. He died before he could. Min-Jae straightened. I'm not. The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul was doing what Seoul did at night, burning bright and humming under its own weight, indifferent and extraordinary. The city that had made the Kong name mean something had no opinion about what happened inside this room. It just kept going. Nia looked at the man she had married and thought about all the versions of him she'd been given access to over 2 years. The careful version, the controlled version, the rare unguarded late-night version, and now this one. The one that had decided something irreversible and was standing in the decision with his whole body. She picked up Junho's folder. She turned to the page with Park Do-hwan's Busan property. She set it in front of Min-Jae. Then let's make sure, she said, that when he walks in here, there isn't a single thing he can say that we haven't already prepared for. Min-Jae looked at the page, then at her. Something shifted in his face that wasn't quite a smile, was in the neighborhood of one, was built from the same materials. And he pulled the chair beside him away from the table and held it there, and she understood the gesture and sat, and they bent over the folder together in the quiet room with the evidence spread between them and the night deepening outside. And Min-Jae picked up his phone and called Junho and said 4 words that would set the next 12 hours in motion. Bring him to Seoul. He ended the call, set the phone down. And in the silence that followed, Hye-suk appeared in the doorway. No one had seen her come. She moved quietly the way she always had. And she stood there looking at her son and his wife sitting together at the table with their heads bent over the same page. And whatever she saw in that image did something to her face that Nia only caught from the corner of her eye. It looked, from that angle, like a woman who had spent 17 years protecting something and was finally beginning to understand, at a cost she hadn't expected to pay, what protecting the wrong thing. The call to Park Do-hwan went out at 10:47. Min-Jae made it himself. That was the first deliberate choice, not Junho, not an intermediary, not a message delivered through layers of insulation, the way most sensitive communications move through the organization. Min-Jae picked up the phone and dialed the number that Shin Dae-jung had provided with the expression of a man handing over the last thing he had to give, and he waited through 4 rings with his elbow on the table and his eyes on the middle distance. Park answered on the 5th. Min-Jae? The voice was smooth, carefully smooth, in the way of someone who had been anticipating this call and had rehearsed their register. Surprised, but not too surprised. Warm, but not incautious. It's been a long time. It has, Min-Jae said. His own voice was completely neutral. The neutrality of a surface with nothing underneath it, which was its own kind of tell for people who knew how to read him. But Park didn't know how to read him. Park had spent 14 years reading Hye-suk. I heard you were back in Seoul, Park said. Then you heard correctly. A pause. Is everything all right? With your family? Min-Jae looked at the wall in front of him. I'd like to meet. There are things that have come to my attention that I think would be better discussed in person. Another pause. Longer this time. The quality of this pause was different. It was a calculating pause, not a conversational one. Nia, sitting beside Min-Jae with her eyes on the legal pad where she'd been making notes, felt the shift in the room even without being able to hear the other end of the call. Of course, Park said. What did you have in mind? The estate. Tomorrow evening. Min-Jae kept his voice level, unhurried, the voice of a man who had called to schedule a meeting rather than close a trap. I think it's time we had a proper conversation. My mother has told me certain things. I have questions that I think only you can answer. The pause this time was very short, which meant Park had already decided. I'll be there, Park said. Min-Jae ended the call. He set the phone on the table and sat for a moment without speaking. "He'll come early," Junho said from the doorway. He'd been there for the last part of the call, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and his face in its customary configuration of processing. He'll want to assess the situation before the scheduled time, try to read the estate, read the staff, read whatever he can. "I know," Min-Jae said. "Let him. I want everything that was going to Park through the estate contact to stop as of tonight. Wrong information from here forward. He thinks he knows what he's walking into. He should believe that until he's already inside." Junho nodded and left. Nia looked at Min-Jae. "You said tomorrow evening." "Yes." "That gives us 18 hours, he said, which is enough." He picked up the legal pad, reviewed the notes she'd made. His eyes moved down the page fast, the way he read when he wasn't performing reading for anyone but actually doing it. "The financial documentation needs to be in the hands of the appropriate legal contacts before Park arrives. If he tries to release anything to external authorities during or after this meeting, I want them to already be in receipt of the counter documentation. The timing matters. Your lawyer, not the organization's lawyers. Independent counsel. People who are not connected to any of the Kong holdings." He was already writing. "I have 2 contacts who handle this specific kind of financial exposure case. I need them on a call in the morning. And the organization members? The ones who are still," she gestured slightly, "whose loyalty you're not certain of. Junho is working through that tonight." His pen moved across the page. "By tomorrow evening, everyone in that room will have been individually spoken to. I'll know exactly what I have before Park walks in." Nia looked at the document. Her father-in-law's last instructions, sitting on the table between them, like an answer to a question that had been asked 17 years too early. "What about your mother?" she said. Min-Jae's pen stopped. He didn't look up immediately. He looked at the page for another second, then set the pen down. "She stays," he said. "She needs to be in the room when this happens. She needs to hear—" He stopped, reorganized. "Park has been controlling her through fear for 14 years. Using her guilt about your father's death, using the evidence about the organization's operations, using everything she didn't tell me as leverage to keep the payments coming." His jaw set. "She's going to watch it end." "She's scared, Min-Jae. I know she is. Genuinely scared, not of consequences, of Park himself." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that too. She's been living with him as a threat for longer than I've been alive." He looked at her then. The look was complex, gratitude and exhaustion, and something that was not quite tenderness but was constructed from related materials. "You're defending her," he said. "I'm not defending what she did to me," Nia said carefully. "I'm describing her accurately. Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "They are." He picked up the pen again. They worked until 2 in the morning. The estate was different by the time the next afternoon arrived. Nia felt it when she came downstairs at noon, having slept 4 hours and dreamed nothing she could remember. The air in the building had changed quality, had the specific density that she associated with Min-Jae's world at its most serious, the atmosphere of a place that has been deliberately configured for something consequential. The regular staff moved differently. Certain doors that were usually open were closed. Junho had been there since 8. She could tell from the coffee cups in the kitchen and the particular arrangement of folders on the dining room table where he'd clearly been working. She found Min-Jae in the study. He was on the phone, a different call from the dozens she'd witnessed the previous night. This one quieter, more technical, the cadence of a man walking a lawyer through financial documentation. He acknowledged her with a look when she entered. She sat in the chair by the window and waited. When he finished the call, he set the phone down and looked at her. "Did you sleep?" 4 hours. He nodded. He looked like he'd slept 2, maybe less. There was a quality around his eyes that she recognized from the very early months of their relationship, before she'd fully understood the nature of his work. The particular exhaustion of someone who had been operating at high intensity for an extended period and was running on something beyond ordinary energy. Not adrenaline exactly, more like purpose. Like the body finding resources it didn't advertise. "The lawyers have the documentation," he said. "Both sets. The original evidence my father prepared and Nia's compiled records. They're filed as of this morning with independent counsel and are now also in the possession of a financial investigative contact who has agreed to hold rather than act until I authorize. He paused. Park cannot release anything to those parties tonight that they don't already have more complete versions of. And if he goes to someone else, media or... he won't. Min-Jae leaned back slightly in the chair. Park has spent 14 years protecting his anonymity. He's been operating below visibility because visibility would expose him as much as it would expose us. Going to media means he becomes the story too, his name on documents that connect him to the original theft. He shook his head. His leverage is only useful while it's private. The moment it becomes public, he loses everything. Nia absorbed this. So he's going to try to use it as a threat, not actually release it. Yes. He's going to walk into that room tonight and try to negotiate his way to a position where the payments continue and nothing changes. He's going to try to convince me, and the organization, that the cost of moving against him outweighs the benefit. His voice had an edge to it now that hadn't been there a minute ago. He's very good at that calculation. He's been doing it successfully for a long time. But the calculation has changed. Yes. Because you're not afraid of the exposure anymore. Min-Jae looked at his father's document, which had been moved to the desk and was sitting under a paperweight in the position of something that would be needed later. My father wasn't afraid of it either, he said. He decided the truth was worth more than the secret. He was right. A beat. He just didn't get to finish proving it. Yesuk appeared in the doorway of the study. She looked, Nia thought, like a woman who had been awake all night and had used the time not to rest but to arrive somewhere. Not peace. That was too simple a word for whatever was on her face. More like resolution. The specific quality that comes when a person has been fighting something for a long time and has finally stopped. She looked at her son. Tell me what you need me to do tonight, she said. Min-Jae looked at his mother for a long moment. Nia watched the thing that moved between them, old and complicated and weighted with 17 years of a particular kind of silence, and did not try to interpret it. Tell the truth, Min-Jae said. When he is in that room and he tries to use what he knows about this family's history, I need you to tell the truth. Not the protected version, the actual one. Yesuk's face tightened slightly, then released. All right. Everything you've told me. In front of the organization. In front of Park. I understand. Including what you suspect about my father's death. The tightening came back. Stayed longer this time. Min-Jae, I know you have no proof. I know it's a suspicion. But I need Park to understand that I know what I suspect, and that it is now one of the things on the table. He held her gaze. Can you do that? Yesuk looked at her son, then, briefly, at Nia, then back. Yes, she said. Park Do-hwan arrived at 6:42, 18 minutes before the scheduled time, exactly as Junho had predicted. Nia was upstairs when she heard the car on the gravel. She was standing at the window of the bedroom, dressed in the particular way she'd decided on that morning. Not formal, not submissive, not the version of herself she might have worn to manage other people's comfort. Just herself. Dark clothes, clean lines, nothing that required her to perform anything. She watched the car from above. Park stepped out, and was exactly what she'd expected from the photographs and the files she'd compiled, and exactly different from what photographs prepared you for. He was in his early 60s, well-dressed in a way that communicated money without announcing it, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades moving through rooms with confidence. Not physical size, he wasn't a large man. It was something else. The ease of someone who had never, in a very long time, walked into a situation he didn't believe he could control. He looked at the estate and she saw him doing what Junho had said, reading it, assessing, taking in the quality of stillness, the positioning of people, the atmosphere of the evening. She watched him recalibrate something in real time, though she couldn't tell from this angle what conclusion he was drawing. He was good. She could see that from a distance. He was genuinely, professionally good at this. She went downstairs. The main room had been arranged. Min-Jae had done it himself, which Nia understood was not incidental. The table that had held the organization meeting the previous night had been reconfigured, documents placed, chairs positioned, the physical geometry of the room set up to communicate something specific without stating it. The evidence was visible but not theatrical. present in the way that facts are present when they don't need decoration. The senior members were already seated when Park was shown in. Junho stood near the door. Two others were positioned at points in the room that were not accidental. Park walked in and read all of it in approximately 4 seconds. Nia watched his face do the things she'd seen from the window. The rapid assessment, the recalibration, the practice settling into a position of apparent ease that was covering something more active underneath. Min-Jae was standing. Park looked at him with an expression that was almost warm, almost paternal. The expression of a man who had known the Kong family for decades and was treating this as a reunion rather than what it was. "Min-Jae," he said. He extended his hand. Min-Jae looked at the hand for 1 full second. He did not take it. Park's hand lowered. His expression did not change visibly, but something in his eyes did. A shift, small and fast, like a gauge reading adjusting. "Sit down," Min-Jae said. It was not phrased as a suggestion. Park sat. He looked at the documents on the table, looked at them without appearing to look at them, which was a skill, and Nia noted that he had it. His eyes moved across the spread of evidence in the time it took him to pull his chair in and settle into it, and she watched him identifying things, categorizing them, running the same kind of calculation she'd seen Min-Jae run 100 times. "You've been busy," Park said pleasantly. "Yes," Min-Jae said. He sat now, directly across, close enough that the table between them was the only thing separating their faces. "We have." Park's eyes moved to Nia, standing near the wall to Min-Jae's right. "Mrs. Kong," he said. His voice was perfectly calibrated, warm, without being familiar, respectful, without conceding anything. "I've heard a great deal about your diligence." "Then you've been well informed," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she decided to accept as a gift. Park looked back at Min-Jae. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture of openness, of reason, of let's talk like adults. "I understand there are concerns," he said, "about old accounts, old arrangements. I want you to know that I have always operated in what I believed were the best interests of this family. Your father was my closest colleague for 11 years. Anything I did, any arrangement I made, was with the organization's stability in mind. My father," Min-Jae said, "prepared documentation of what you did. Before he died. He intended to remove you from the organization and expose what you'd taken." He kept his voice even. "I think you know that." A very slight pause. "Your father and I had disagreements toward the end." "That's true. But I think the full context of those disagreements would—" "He also left me instructions." Min-Jae pushed the document toward the center of the table. "Properly prepared, witnessed, his seal." He watched Park look at it. "You knew about this document." "I knew your father was preparing certain materials, yes." "You knew he'd arranged for me to inherit the documentation of your theft and handle it as I saw fit. Those are strong words. They're accurate words." Min-Jae's voice didn't shift. "You also knew that my mother had the document and had chosen not to activate it." He leaned forward slightly. "Because you told her what would happen if she did." Park's pleasant expression was still in place, but it had developed a quality, like a mask that fit perfectly, but was one size too rigid for what was moving underneath it. "I had conversations with your mother over the years," he said carefully. "We both understood that certain situations required careful management. You blackmailed her. You used evidence of my father's operational decisions to threaten this family into silence and continued payment." Min-Jae's voice was still flat, still even. "For 14 years, while you had reason to believe that you were responsible for my father's death." The room changed. It changed the way rooms change when something that has been moving slowly suddenly accelerates, the air pressure shifting, the attention of everyone present, snapping to a single point. The men around the table had been still before. Now they were a different kind of still, the kind that comes before movement. Park's mask held. He was remarkable at it, Nia thought. He sat across from the son of a man he had quite possibly murdered, and his face remained composed and his hands remained relaxed on the table surface, and his voice, when it came, was measured. "That is an extraordinary accusation," he said. "Yes," Min-Jae said, "it is. You have no evidence. I have my father's timeline. I have the account records. I have the fact that he died 4 months after beginning to prepare the documentation against you, with no prior history of cardiac illness. Min-Jae paused. I also have 17 years of watching how you operate, and I know how you solve problems. You're describing a coincidence. I'm describing a pattern. Park was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, something had shifted in his register, just slightly, but enough. The warmth was gone. The pleasant paternal tone had been replaced by something more direct, more professional. The actual version of him, Nia thought, finally. Let me be honest with you, Park said, because I think you're a man who appreciates directness, and I respect that. He looked at Min-Jae steadily. Whatever documentation you've prepared, whatever legal contacts you've engaged, there are things in your family's operational history that will not survive scrutiny. You know this. I know this. The moment this becomes a public matter, the moment authorities begin examining these accounts, the legitimate holdings of the Kong organization are exposed to investigative attention that will cost you years and possibly everything you've built. He let that sit for a moment. I don't want that. You don't want that. Which means there is a conversation to be had here, a reasonable conversation, about how we move forward in a way that protects everyone's interests. Silence. Then Min-Jae said, Is that the offer? It's a framework. Tell me the specific offer. Park considered him for a moment, then, The arrangement continues. Modified terms. I'm willing to discuss the amounts, even a significant reduction. The information I hold remains private. The organization continues operating without investigative interference. Everyone at this table goes home tonight with their situation intact. He paused. Or you pursue this publicly, and we all pay a price that none of us can fully calculate in advance. Min-Jae looked at him. Then he looked at Nia. She met his eyes and gave him nothing prescriptive. No nod, no expression of urgency. Just presence. Just, I'm here, I'm with you, whatever comes next, I'm here. He looked back at Park. 6 weeks ago, Min-Jae said, an accountant in this organization received information from your contact in my estate staff about what my wife had found. He watched Park's expression. That contact has been replaced. The information my mother provided you with, about the estate status, about my wife's investigation, about this family's vulnerabilities, has been your operating assumption going into this room tonight. Park said nothing. You assumed my mother was still afraid. You assumed the organization's loyalty was divided enough to make confrontation costly. You assumed that I would, when presented with the math, make the same calculation my mother made for 14 years. Min-Jae picked up the document, his father's document, and held it. You assumed that the secret was still worth more to us than the exposure. And it isn't? Park's voice was still controlled, but something behind it had shifted. A reassessment happening in real time, like the one Nia had watched from the upstairs window. The independent counsel who received our documentation this morning, Min-Jae said, has been instructed to act regardless of what happens in this room tonight. He set the document down. The financial investigative contact has everything Nia compiled, cross-referenced against my father's original evidence, with a timeline and a legal analysis. It moves at midnight regardless of what you do. Park went very still. You can release whatever you have, Min-Jae continued. Every piece of operational history you've been holding, every claim about my father's decisions, all of it. He paused. They already have our version, with documentation, with the evidence that shows where the money actually went and who took it and over what period of time. His voice dropped slightly. You can blow this up, Park. You can make it as loud and as damaging as you want. But the first name on every document, the first name anyone reads when the investigation opens, is yours. The room was completely silent. Park looked at the evidence on the table, looked at Min-Jae, looked at the men seated around the room, Junho, the others, the faces of people who had been given back to this organization rather than left in Park's orbit. He looked at Hye-suk, who had not spoken since she entered the room, and who was sitting at the far end of the table with her hands folded and her face composed with the specific composure of someone who has decided to stop running. Hye-suk, he said, and his voice had changed again, had gone to something that was almost gentle, almost intimate, the tone of someone who had spent 14 years in a particular relationship with a person and was now appealing to the history of it. You understand what he's proposing. You understand what this will cost. Hye-suk looked at Park Do-hwan. She looked at him for a long time with something in her face that Nia watched carefully, something that moved through multiple stages in the space of a few seconds. Fear, yes. Exhaustion, yes. The specific weight of 14 years of a particular kind of bondage. And then something else, something that came after all of those. I understand what it costs to say nothing, Hyesuk said. Her voice was steady. I paid that price for 14 years. She looked at Park without flinching. I told myself, that I was protecting my son. I was protecting you. Hyesuk, you came to me 2 weeks after my husband's funeral, she said. You sat in my house, and you expressed your grief, and you told me you were there to help, and then you told me what would happen if I activated my husband's instructions. Her voice didn't waver. You have sat on what you may have done to my husband for 17 years, and you have used my silence about it to keep me paying you. And I let you. She paused. I let you because I was afraid, and because I was alone, and because I made a decision that seemed like survival and turned into a cage. She looked at Min-Jae. I should have given my son his father's document the day he turned 18. I should have trusted him with it. She looked back at Park. I am telling you now that I suspect what you did, in front of every person in this room. And I am telling you that I have told my son everything, every payment, every threat, every arrangement, and that I will tell anyone else who needs to hear it. Park's face went through something that was not pleasant to watch, the controlled surface cracking in a way that revealed what had always been underneath it, which was not warmth or reason, but something colder and considerably less composed. You have no proof, he said. No, Hyesuk said. I don't. But I have a timeline, and I have a son who will not stop looking until he finds what I couldn't, and I have... Her voice shifted, just slightly. I have nothing left that you can threaten me with. You took my husband. You took 14 years. You took my relationship with my daughter-in-law. She straightened. There is nothing left. Park looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Min-Jae. And what Nia saw on Park's face in that moment was something she recognized from very different contexts, the look of a calculation failing. The specific expression of a man who has built an entire strategy on an assumption and has just discovered, in the worst possible setting, that the assumption was wrong. He stood up. This is a mistake, he said. The pleasantness was completely gone now. What was underneath it was neither warm nor cold. It was functional, dangerous in the specific way of something that has been cornered. You don't know the full scope of what you're activating, the investigations your father's operations could generate. I told you, Min-Jae said, and rose from his chair. Everything that was going to come out is already in the hands of independent counsel, filed this morning. If what I've put there is complete, the investigation focuses on the source of the contamination. He came around the table, walked toward Park. Not fast, measured, deliberate, each step with its own weight. And if there's more, if there are operational details that surface during an investigation that I don't yet know about, then that's the cost of doing what should have been done 17 years ago. Park held his ground. Nia gave him that. The man held his ground. You'll lose things, he said. Things you've spent years building. Yes, Min-Jae said. He stopped 2 feet from Park. The height difference between them was not dramatic but was real, and Min-Jae's stillness in this moment had a specific quality, not threatening in any demonstrative way, but present with a density that couldn't be ignored. I've thought about that. What I'll lose. What this costs. And my father made the same calculation and decided it was worth it. His voice was very quiet now, quiet enough that the room had to be silent to hear it, which it was. I watched my mother spend 17 years paying for his death in installments. I watched my wife endure a year of this house being turned against her because she found what he stole and was too honest not to document it. He looked at Park with the expression that Nia had come to understand was his truest face. You want to know if I've weighed the cost? I've weighed it. Every night for the last 3 years, I've been living over an account that was being bled by a man who believed my family's fear of exposure was permanent. His jaw set. It wasn't permanent. It was just long. Park looked at him. Something moved in the room, not physical, but perceptible, like a change in the pressure, like the moment before something breaks. Last chance, Park said. He said it quietly, and the quietness of it had a specific quality, the last warning of a man who understands that the next action cannot be taken back. Min-Jae looked at him. "The documents move at midnight," he said. "They moved when I called you last night. There is no version of this conversation that changes that." He paused. "There is only a version where you cooperate with the investigation that follows, which I am told by counsel will result in a significantly different outcome for you, and a version where you don't." Park's hands, which had been at his sides, moved slightly, just slightly. Junho moved faster. What followed was not long and was not elegant and was over before it fully registered. Park's attempt to reach something in his jacket, Junho's interception, two other men in the room closing the distance in time that felt impossible given how far they'd been, and Park Do-hwan finding himself contained in a way that removed options from the immediate situation with quiet professional finality. The room settled. Park stood very still now with assistance. His face had gone to something that was beyond the mask and beyond the functional calculation, to something raw and genuinely frightened in a way that all the composure in the world hadn't prepared him for. Because he had walked into this room believing the same thing he'd believed for 14 years, and the belief had been wrong, and he was standing in the wreckage of that wrongness with nowhere left to position himself. Min-Jae straightened his jacket. He looked at Park with an expression that had no satisfaction in it, which Nia noticed and which surprised her less than it once might have. This was not about satisfaction. It had never been about satisfaction. "You told my mother," he said, "that if she ever moved against you, everything she was protecting would collapse." He reached back and picked up the document from the table. His father's document, the seal broken, the last instructions of a man who had tried to tie up his affairs before the end. He held it in front of Park. "My father didn't collapse when he decided to move against you. He was stopped before he could finish." He lowered the document. "I'm not going to be stopped." Park looked at him. "You don't know what you've started," he said. His voice was still controlled, the last piece of the composure still functioning, though just barely. "No," Min-Jae agreed. "I don't know everything that's coming." He stepped back, looked at Junho. "Get him a phone. Let him call counsel." He paused. "The voluntary cooperation window closes at midnight. After that, it's whatever the investigation makes of what they find." He turned away from Park then, turned away from him the way you turn away from something that no longer requires your direct attention. And he looked at the room. At the men seated around the table, each of them absorbing what they'd witnessed. At his mother, who sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the surface in front of her, and something on her face that was not relief and not grief, but occupied the territory between them. And at Naya. She was still near the wall where she'd positioned herself at the beginning. She had not moved during any of it, had stood exactly there, present and still, watching with the quality of attention that she'd developed over a year of living in a house where she'd had to pay very close attention to survive it. Min-Jae looked at his wife across the room. She looked back. Neither of them spoke. But something passed between them that did not need words. The specific recognition of two people who have come through something together that tested the full weight of what they were to each other and found it, against all reasonable expectation, sufficient. Behind them, Park Do-hwan sat down. Not by choice. He sat with the quality of a man whose options have been reduced to one and who is in the process of deciding whether to take it. The clock on the wall moved toward 11, 53 minutes to midnight. In an office on the other side of Seoul, the independent counsel was at his desk with a folder in front of him and a standing instruction to act at 12 o'clock. Regardless of any communication he received before then, and the folder contained 17 years of a dead man's evidence and 8 months of a living woman's careful documentation, and the full, devastating shape of what Park Do-hwan had done, and what it had cost, and what it had broken, and what it had killed, and at midnight all of it was going to begin moving through channels that had no reverse. Min-Jae stood in the center of the room and felt the weight of the next 53 minutes like a physical thing, like the specific pressure of an irreversible action in the last moments before it becomes irreversible. And he looked at his father's document one more time, the aged paper, and the careful handwriting, and the broken seal, and he thought about a man who had made the same decision in a different room, in a different year, and had not lived to see it through. He was going to see it through. But first, in the 12 seconds of stillness before the room reorganized itself around what came next, he crossed to where Naya was standing, and he stood beside her without saying anything. And she didn't say anything either, and they stood together in the particular silence of two people who have... The clock moved past 11:15. Park Do-hwan sat at the far end of the table with a phone in his hand that he hadn't used yet, and Nia watched him from across the room and understood, in the way she'd come to understand certain things over the past 2 years, that he was not deciding whether to call counsel. He was deciding whether the call mattered, whether anything in the next 45 minutes could alter a situation that had already moved past the point where alteration was possible. She watched him arrive at the answer. He made the call. It was brief. 4 minutes, clinical, the cadence of a man reporting a situation to someone trained to receive bad reports without reacting emotionally. When he finished, he set the phone on the table in front of him and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, with the expression of someone taking inventory of what they had left. Not much, that expression said. Not much left. Junho spoke quietly to 2 men near the door, and they left, and the room reconfigured slightly, fewer people, the temperature of it dropping by a degree as the density of bodies reduced. The remaining members of the organization sat with the particular stillness of people who had witnessed something and were in the process of integrating it. Nobody spoke. The clock was the loudest thing in the room. Min-Jae stood near the window. He'd been there for the last 20 minutes, not looking out, the blinds were drawn, but using the wall at his back the way he sometimes used walls, as a fixed point while everything else moved. Nia had watched him do it enough times to understand it wasn't passivity. It was how he processed. He needed to be still while his mind did the part of the work that couldn't happen in motion. She went to stand beside him, not touching, just beside. He looked at her sideways, just briefly. 40 minutes, he said, quietly, for her only. I know. After midnight, whatever the investigation generates, it generates. We won't control the timeline. I know, Min-Jae. He was quiet for a moment. You might want to call your mother. Nia blinked. That was not what she'd expected him to say. Not tonight, necessarily, he said, and something in his voice had shifted to a register she'd only heard a handful of times, the one that came out very late at night or very early in the morning, when the professional architecture dropped enough for the actual person to have a turn. But soon, when this starts moving publicly, there will be coverage, attention. Your name is attached to certain holdings. I don't want her to see something before you've had a chance to... Hey! Nia put her hand on his arm. Just that. She's my mother. She's going to be more worried about me than about any coverage. That's not a problem you need to solve. He looked at her hand on his arm. I should have protected you better, he said. In this house. From my mother. From all of it. You didn't know. I should have known. She thought about that. About whether to argue with it or let it stand. You would have known, she said finally, if I told you. That's on both of us. He absorbed that. She felt him absorb it, the slight shift in his posture that indicated something had been received and filed. We're going to have a conversation, he said, when all of this is over, about what we tell each other, about what we don't. Yes, she said, we are. I mean a real one, not, he paused, searching for the right word, not managed, not where we're both deciding in advance what the other person can handle. I know what you mean. She looked at him. Same goes for you. He met her eyes. Same goes for me, he agreed. At 11:58, Min-Jae crossed the room to where Park Do-hwan was sitting. He stood in front of him and looked at him for a moment without speaking. Park looked back. The composure was entirely gone now, had been gone for the better part of an hour, which Nia suspected was the longest it had been absent in decades. What remained on Park's face was something she hadn't expected to find there. Not defiance, not bargaining, but a kind of exhaustion that mirrored in a disturbing way the exhaustion she'd seen on Hye-suk's face throughout the previous evening. 2 people, she thought, who had been running from the same event for 17 years, from opposite directions. When the investigation opens, Min-Jae said, your counsel will receive a full copy of the documentation, both my father's original evidence and what Nia compiled. He paused. Voluntary cooperation with the financial investigators will be confirmed as available to you through midnight tonight. After that, I can't speak to what the investigators offer. Park looked up at him. You're giving me a last chance. I'm telling you the timeline. What you do with it is your decision. You sound like your father, Park said. Something moved across Min-Jae's face, fast and uncontrolled, and then gone. Good, he said. Park was quiet for a moment. Then, he was going to destroy me. Your father. He'd made up his mind, the evidence, the document, all of it. He wasn't leaving room for anything. He was leaving room for what you actually deserved, Min-Jae said, which is different from what you wanted. Park looked at the table, at the spread of evidence that had been laid out hours ago and had not moved. His evidence. 17 years of his leverage, reduced to paper on a table in the house of the son of the man he'd wronged. I didn't plan for it to go as far as it did, Park said. And he said it in a way that was strange. Not quite an apology, not quite a confession. Something in the category of a man saying a thing aloud for the first time, because the keeping of it has become more exhausting than the saying. The money, in the beginning, it was a calculation. Your father had built something extraordinary, and the margins were large and the transfers were structured in a way that left almost no trace. I told myself many things. He paused. By the time he found out, I had been doing it for 6 years. 6 years is long enough that you stop being able to remember who you were before it. Is that what you tell yourself? Min-Jae said. Not aggressively, just with the precision of someone who wants to understand the mechanism. It's what I know. Park looked up at him. I knew what was in that document. I knew what your father had prepared. When he died, he stopped. His eyes moved away. When he died, I went to your mother because I believed I had no other option. That part was true. I had no other option. You had the option of confessing, Min-Jae said, to a 17-year-old who had just inherited one of the most dangerous organizations in Korea and was being watched by every rival and every authority in the country. Park's voice had a dry quality now. Not sarcastic, just drained of everything that wasn't factual. I calculated the odds and I chose survival. And my father's death? The room went very still. Park looked at the table for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from anything it had been all evening, quieter and more careful, and weighted in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. I made a call, he said. 3 days after your father told me he was moving against me. I made a call to a man whose specialty was solving problems of the medical variety. I gave him information about your father's schedule, his private physician, his habits. He stopped. I told myself it might not come to anything, that perhaps your father would change his mind, that perhaps the call would never be acted on. He looked up at Min-Jae. It was acted on. The room had no sound in it. Nia realized she had stopped breathing and made herself start again. The air tasted different. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she wasn't usually aware of it. Min-Jae stood completely still in front of Park Do-hwan. He was so still that the stillness itself was a kind of statement. Every person in the room was watching him and none of them moved, and the clock on the wall ticked past midnight without anyone acknowledging it, and the documents moved without ceremony into channels that had been waiting for them. Min-Jae's jaw worked once, just once, the only external indication of what was happening internally. Say it plainly, he said. His voice came out barely above a conversation volume. What you just said, say it in a complete sentence. Park held his eyes. I arranged for your father's death. Nia put her hand over her mouth. Not from shock exactly. She had known this was possible, had known it since Min-Jae's mother had said what she'd said the previous evening. But knowing something is possible and hearing it confirmed in a room full of witnesses are two different experiences, and her body apparently had a distinct response to the second one. Min-Jae stood there for a long time. Then he stepped back. One step. The step of a man who needs to be slightly farther from something to look at it clearly. He turned to Junho. Make sure the financial investigators receive the recording of this conversation along with the documentation. Junho nodded once. He had been standing near the recording equipment that Min-Jae had installed, quietly, professionally, as part of the evening's preparation, and had been monitoring it throughout. Min-Jae looked at Park one more time. You're going to spend, he said slowly, a significant portion of the remaining years of your life inside a process that is going to examine every decision you made from the beginning. The theft, the payments, the blackmail, He stopped, and when he continued, his voice had a quality that was neither anger nor grief, but occupied the exact space where those two things meet. The call you made. He paused. I want you to understand that that is not a punishment I'm delivering. It's a consequence you created. There is a difference. Park said nothing. Min-Jae walked out of the room. Nia followed him. He went to the study. Not to work. He didn't sit at the desk or pick up anything. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, and Nia came in behind him and closed the door. And they were alone in the quiet of the study, with the house going through its reconfiguration around them, the sound of movement and low voices from the main room, the distant sound of cars in the driveway as people began to leave. Min-Jae put his hands flat on his desk surface and leaned on them, his head down. Nia stood behind him. She didn't reach out. She waited. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, to the desk, "He killed my father." "Yes," she said. "My mother suspected for 17 years and paid him to stay quiet about it." She was terrified, Nia said. Not excusing, just true. I know she was terrified. He straightened. His hands came off the desk. I understand why she made every choice she made. I understand the logic of all of it. He turned around. His face, in the low light of the study, looked like what it was. The face of a man who has just had a grief he thought he'd processed a long time ago, hand him an entirely new set of dimensions to process. Understanding it doesn't make it. No, she said. It doesn't. He sat down on the small couch against the wall. Not the desk chair. The couch, which she'd always thought was too small for the room, had never understood why it was there. Now she did. Some rooms need a place to be human in. She sat beside him. They sat there for a while without talking, and Nia listened to the house around them and thought about everything that had happened inside it over the past 36 hours and tried to find the thread that ran through all of it, the connective tissue, the thing that would make it cohere into something you could carry forward. What she found was this. The house had been full of people protecting people from the truth. Min-Jae's father had discovered Park's theft and said nothing while he gathered evidence, protecting his organization from premature exposure. His mother had buried the evidence to protect her son from a dangerous man. Nia had hidden the abuse she'd suffered to protect her husband from a painful choice. And Park had hidden behind all of it, using everyone's protective instincts as cover for what he'd done. The truth had not hurt less for being hidden. It had just accumulated interest. I want to leave Seoul for a while, Min-Jae said. She looked at him. Not permanently, he said quickly. The organization needs to go through what it's going to go through, and I'll be here for that. But after, when the immediate phase is over. He was looking at the far wall. I want to go somewhere that doesn't know my name and stay there for longer than a week. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Just okay? What did you want me to say? I don't know. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd seen him do maybe twice in 2 years, reserved for moments of genuine disorientation. I thought you'd have an opinion about where. Georgia, she said. He blinked. My mother's house, Nia said, for at least 2 weeks. You can sleep in the room with the yellow curtains that you hate and eat everything she puts in front of you without complaining, and let her tell you stories about me as a child that are designed to be embarrassing. He stared at her. Something in his face was doing something she hadn't seen before, struggling between several things that resolved, after a moment, into something that was almost a smile but was more honest than that. Raw at the edges. Your mother's house. You need somewhere that has nothing to do with any of this, she said, and I need to go home. She looked at him steadily. She's going to feed you too much and ask too many questions, and her neighbor has a dog that barks at everything. It's going to be fine. Min-Jae looked at his wife. Then he laughed. It was short, and it was exhausted, and it had tears somewhere underneath it that didn't make it to the surface. And it was the most genuine sound she'd heard from him in 36 hours, and it filled the small room in a way that the small room had probably needed for a long time. Okay, he said. Georgia. They found Hyasuk in the garden. It was past 1 in the morning, and she was sitting on the stone bench near the far wall with her coat on and her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing with the focused attention of someone who has a great deal to look at on the inside. She did not seem surprised when she heard them come through the garden door. She had the manner of someone who had been waiting, though she might not have been waiting for them specifically, just waiting for whatever came next. Min-Jae sat down beside her. Nia stayed standing, not removed, close enough that her presence was felt, far enough to give them the shape of a private conversation. Hyasuk looked at her son. He confessed, she said. Not a question. Yes. She absorbed that. Her hands in her lap tightened slightly and then relaxed. "I've been sitting here thinking about your father," she said, "about the last few months before he died. He was worried about something. I could see it. He didn't tell me the specifics, you know how he was with the work. He tried to keep certain things separate from home, but I could see it. Something was weighing on him." She paused. "I told myself afterward that I'd imagined it, that I was retrospectively assigning meaning to normal behavior because of what happened. I told myself that for a long time." "You didn't imagine it," Min-Jae said. "No." She looked at her hands. "He was preparing, getting his affairs in order as it turned out, in ways I didn't understand until later." A long pause. "I loved your father, Min-Jae. I want you to know that. Whatever the truth of his work involved, whatever decisions he made, I loved him and he loved me, and we built something together that we were proud of." Her voice was very steady. "I don't want you to lose that version of him in all of this." "I'm not going to lose it," Min-Jae said. She looked at him. "He wasn't a perfect man," Min-Jae said. "I've known that for a long time. I knew it when I was 17 and inheriting an organization that required a certain understanding of what he'd actually been doing all those years." He paused. "I also know he tried to fix what Park did. He tried to do the right thing. He died trying," his voice settled. "That's the version of him I'm keeping." Jae-suk's composure did something it hadn't done throughout any of the previous night or this evening. It moved. Not broke. She was too much herself for complete breaks, but shifted, in the way a surface shifts when something underneath it finally releases. "I'm sorry," she said. She was not looking at her son when she said it. She was looking at Nia. Nia met her eyes. "I was afraid," Jae-suk said, "and I was proud, and I was—" She stopped, and when she continued, her voice had the specific quality of someone saying something they have rehearsed many times but have never actually managed to say out loud. "I was jealous of you, of how easily he trusted you, of the way he looks at you." She paused. "I spent 17 years as the most important person in my son's life, and I told myself that was because of sacrifice and love, which was true. But it was also because I needed it to be true, because I had nothing else." She looked at her hands. "And then you arrived, and he looked at you the way your father used to look at me, and I—" She stopped again. "I handled it badly." The garden was quiet around them. The city hummed its distant hum beyond the walls. Nia stood in the night air and let the words land and took her time with what she wanted to say, because some responses matter enough to be chosen carefully. "I know you love your son," she said finally. "I have never doubted that. Whatever else was true, I knew that." Jae-suk looked at her. "I'm not able to tell you tonight that everything is fine," Nia continued, "because it isn't fine. What happened in this house over the past year happened, and it doesn't unhappen because of one conversation or one night of truth-telling." She paused. "But I'm also not telling you that it's permanent. What's permanent and what's just not fixed yet are different things." Jae-suk was quiet for a long moment. "That's generous," she said, "given everything." "It's honest," Nia said, "which I think is more useful." Something moved across Hyesuk's face that was close to, not quite gratitude, but the preliminary condition for it. The recognition that something has been given that didn't have to be given. Min-Jae was watching his wife with an expression that he made no attempt to manage or contain. Nia saw it from her peripheral vision and did not acknowledge it directly, but felt it the way you feel warmth from a specific direction. "You need to go inside," Nia said to Hyesuk. "It's past 1. You've been in the cold for—" "I know how long I've been out here," Hyesuk said, with a trace of her customary dryness that was somehow the most normal thing that had happened all evening. "Then go in," Min-Jae said. Not unkindly, the voice of someone who is tired and is giving the person across from him permission to also be tired. Hyesuk stood. She was smaller standing than she seemed sitting. Age had taken something from her height over the years that she compensated for with posture but couldn't fully recover. She looked at her son for a moment with the particular look of a mother who has very many things she could say and has decided, for once, not to say any of them. She put her hand briefly on his arm, then she went inside. The weeks that followed were neither clean nor simple. The investigation opened 6 days after midnight. It was methodical and comprehensive and moved through the Kong organization's financial holdings with the thoroughness that Min-Jae had anticipated and had prepared for. as much as anyone can prepare for an excavation of their own foundations. The legitimate holdings were separated from the compromised accounts by a process that took 11 weeks and required the ongoing involvement of the independent counsel Min-Jae had engaged and 2 additional legal teams working in parallel. There were losses, real ones. 3 holdings that couldn't be satisfactorily separated from the contaminated accounts were frozen and ultimately forfeited. A business interest in Busan that Min-Jae had spent 4 years developing was suspended pending investigation and did not reopen. 2 men in the organization who had been more deeply involved with Park than the initial conversations had revealed were removed and handed to the appropriate processes. Park Do-hwan cooperated with the financial investigators in the way that men cooperate when cooperation is the only card they have left. His counsel negotiated terms. The negotiation took months. At the end of it, what remained was still more than Nia suspected he deserved, but less than he'd had the previous morning of the rest of his life. And the investigation into his role in Kang Sung-jin's death was handed to a separate authority that moved more slowly and with a weight that had no negotiated resolution attached to it. Min-Jae did not discuss that investigation publicly. He had said what he needed to say in the room where it needed to be said. What happened next was in the hands of processes he had set in motion and could not and did not try to control. He gave one statement, through counsel, that described his family's awareness of his father's death having been potentially non-natural and the reasons those suspicions had not been brought forward sooner. The statement contained his mother's name. It had been drafted with Hye-suk's knowledge and her explicit agreement. She had read it over twice in Min-Jae's study, sitting very straight in the chair across from him, and then she had set it on the desk and said, "Yes, file it." No elaboration, just yes. They went to Georgia in the 4th month. They flew in on a Tuesday afternoon that was overcast and humid in the specific way of late summer in the American South, and Nia's mother was waiting at the arrivals area of the regional airport with a handmade sign that said, "Welcome home, Nae and the husband," in letters that were each a different color, which was so completely characteristic of her that Nia laughed before she'd fully processed it. Min-Jae saw the sign and did not laugh, but looked at it with an expression that Nia catalogued carefully, because she wanted to remember it, the expression of a man encountering a form of warmth he hadn't known he was hungry for. Nia's mother hugged her daughter for a long time without speaking. Then she stepped back and looked at Min-Jae with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a woman who had raised children and seen things, and arrived at a point in life where she said what she meant and meant what she said. "You look tired," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Min-Jae said. "Good thing you're here, then." She picked up one of the bags before he could reach it, which clearly startled him. "Come on. I made food." The 2 weeks at her mother's house were, as Nia had predicted, excessive in all the ways that mattered. Too much food at every meal. Her youngest brother, who came by on the 3rd day and spent 3 hours teaching Min-Jae how to play a card game that had rules that seemed to change mid-game, which Min-Jae accepted with the focused patience of someone determined to understand a system. Her mother's neighbor's dog, which barked at Min-Jae every morning for the first 5 days, and then, on the 6th day, simply walked up to him in the backyard and sat down on his foot, which was apparently dog for "I've decided you're acceptable." Min-Jae sat very still when the dog sat on his foot. Then he reached down, carefully, and put his hand on the animal's back. Nia watched this from the kitchen window, while ostensibly helping her mother with something, and felt the back of her throat do the thing it had been doing at inconvenient moments for 4 months. In the evenings, after dinner, she and Min-Jae sat on the back porch in the plastic chairs that her mother had owned for 20 years, and shouldn't have been comfortable, but somehow were. They talked about ordinary things sometimes. Sometimes they sat and didn't talk, and that was fine too. The silence between them had been changed by everything that happened, had shed the cautious quality it sometimes had, and become something easier to inhabit. On the 9th night, Min-Jae said, "I've been thinking about what my father built." Nia looked at him. Not the organization specifically, the intent of it. He was looking at the darkened yard, the fireflies doing their thing at the edge of the grass, her mother's garden in its summer abundance. He built something that could survive him. He made plans. He tied things off. He prepared documentation and trusted it to the people he believed would use it correctly. He paused. "I spent 17 years finishing what he started without knowing that's what I was doing. And I spent 17 years not knowing who killed him because the people who could have told me were too afraid to say it. And now, Nia said, and now I know. He was quiet for a moment. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would. I thought knowing would feel like resolution, like something completing. He turned to look at her. It feels more like a door that was closed for a long time got opened, and the room behind it is just a room, not a revelation, just the truth, which was always there. The truth usually is, she said. Yes. He looked back at the yard. I'm going to restructure what's left of the organization's holdings around the legitimate side. The parts that survive the investigation cleanly. It's going to take years and the scale is going to be significantly smaller. He paused. I've been thinking about whether smaller is worse, and I think the answer is no. I think I built a lot of what I built to prove something to people who weren't in the room anymore. Nia listened. My father, my mother. Men who doubted whether his 17-year-old son could hold what he'd left. He looked at his hands, which were resting on the plastic armrests of the very modest chair in the very modest backyard of the very modest house where his wife had grown up. I've been proving things for 17 years to an empty room. Not completely empty, she said. He looked at her. I was in the room, she said. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he reached across the small distance between the chairs and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his the way you hold something you're glad you didn't lose. Georgia is not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Less? He looked at the fireflies. I don't know, less of everything. It's a lot, she agreed. Your mother asked me this morning if I wanted to learn to make biscuits. Nia pressed her lips together. What did you say? I said yes. He paused. I don't know how to make biscuits. Nobody does until they learn. He considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. That's true. They sat in the Georgia evening with the fireflies and the dog that was somewhere inside now, and Min-Jae held her hand and Nia listened to the specific quality of his breathing, which she'd become an expert in over 2 years without ever deciding to become an expert in it. And it was slower than it had been in months. Slower and more settled and occupying the full measure of his lungs. Hae-suk called on the 11th day, not to Min-Jae, to Nia. It was the first time in their entire acquaintance that the woman had called her directly, and Nia stood in her mother's kitchen holding the phone and looking at the name on the screen for a long moment before she answered. Hello, she said. Hello. A pause. The particular quality of Hae-suk's pauses was distinguishable from other people's pauses. They had intention in them, architecture. I won't keep you long. I hope the trip is going well. It's good, Nia said. Good. Another pause. I've been staying at my sister's house in Daegu. It's been good to be somewhere else for a while. I'm glad. I've been thinking, Hae-suk said, about what you said in the garden, about what's permanent and what's not fixed yet being different things. Nia waited. I've been sitting with that for several weeks, Hae-suk continued, and I wanted to tell you I intend to do the work of the second category, the not fixed yet. A beat. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I'm not good at this kind of thing. The asking for what I damaged. My generation was not trained for it. No one's born trained for it, Nia said. No. A pause that had something different in it. My son, does he seem... She stopped. He's making biscuits tomorrow, Nia said. A very long pause. Then, from Hae-suk, something that Nia had never once heard in all the time she'd known her. A sound that was small and genuine and startled out of her. A soft exhale that was almost a laugh. He's not going to be good at that, Hae-suk said. Probably not the first time, Nia said. No. Another pause, warmer than the ones before it. Tell him... Hae-suk stopped. Tell him I called, and that I'm well, and that I... She paused once more, and Nia heard her choosing words with the care of someone who understands that certain words, once used, change the shape of things. Tell him I'm proud of him, for finishing what his father started, for not letting it stay buried. Nia stood in her mother's kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window and the smell of whatever was on the stove and the distant sound of the television in the next room. I'll tell him, she said. On their last evening before flying home, Min-Jae went looking for the velvet box. He'd carried it home that first afternoon, the afternoon that had broken everything open. And in the 36 hours that followed, he'd set it down somewhere and not picked it up again. He found it in the study, on the shelf to the left of the desk, sitting exactly where he'd set it, as if it had been waiting patiently. He carried it to the terrace. The Seoul skyline was doing what it did, vast and burning and indifferent and extraordinary. The city that had shaped the Kong name across decades of decisions that had cost various things and built various others and left behind, as such decades always do, a mixed inheritance. Nia came out to the terrace because she'd heard him come in earlier and knew he was home and understood, without needing it explained, that he was outside. She saw the box in his hand. She stood in front of him in the night air with the city behind her and looked at him with the face she reserved for this, for the moments when there was no version of things that was being managed or protected or carefully offered, just the two of them and what they actually were to each other. He opened the box. The necklace sat in the dark velvet the way it had sat for 5 months, the thin gold chain, the single dark pearl, exactly as described to the jeweler on a drive back from Busan when he was thinking about a woman who thought pearls looked like they were hiding light inside them. He lifted it from the box. She turned without him having to ask. He fastened it around her neck, and his hands were warm, as they always were, and she felt the small weight of the pearl settle against her collarbone, and looked at the Seoul skyline over the terrace railing and thought about light being hidden and then being not hidden, and what the difference cost and what it was worth. His hands rested on her shoulders for a moment after he finished. Then he moved to stand beside her. They looked at the city together. "I thought about you," he said. "Every one of those 11 days, in Tokyo and Busan and all the rest of it." He was looking at the skyline. "I kept thinking about coming home, about what it felt like to come home. That feeling when you know someone is there and the house is different because of it." "Different how?" she asked. "Like it's actually a house." He paused. "Rather than a building where I keep my things." Nia looked at the city, at the 10,000 lights that meant 10,000 different things to 10,000 different people, none of which were hers specifically, but all of which composed, in aggregate, the place her life had arrived in. "Min-Jae," she said. "Yes." "Don't go 11 days again without telling me something real." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I won't." They stood on the terrace while Seoul held its breath and released it in 1,000 directions at once, and the pearl sat at her throat holding whatever light pearls hold, and behind them the house that had been a site of so much that was hard was becoming, room by room and day by day, and truth by slow truth, something that deserved the word she'd always hoped it would earn. Home. Not because everything's in it was resolved or clean or finished, but because the people in it had stopped hiding things from each other. And because, as it turned out, that was enough to begin.